This is happening right now in Calgary as you're watching this video. World leaders have descended upon Alberta for the 2025 G7 summit, and the response from the streets has been massive and immediate. We're talking about hundreds of protesters who have literally flooded downtown Calgary, taking over the streets around City Hall and creating scenes that are unprecedented for a Canadian G7 summit. Police estimated roughly 500 people showed up outside Calgary City Hall just on day one of this three-day summit, but what we're seeing goes far beyond typical Canadian demonstrations. The images and videos coming out of downtown Calgary in the past 48 hours show a level of organized protest activity that has authorities deploying significant security measures, including tactical units and specialized equipment that most Canadians have never seen deployed domestically. This is breaking news that's unfolding in real time, and what's happening on Calgary streets is sending shockwaves through Canadian political circles. Before we dive deep into what's actually happening on the ground right now in Calgary, make sure you hit that subscribe button and smash the like if you want to stay ahead of the biggest breaking stories across Canada. Drop a comment below telling me what you think about these massive G7 protests. Are they justified democratic expression, or are they crossing lines? Your perspective matters as this story continues to develop hour by hour. The scale and intensity of what we're witnessing in Calgary is truly remarkable for Canada. This isn't your typical peaceful Canadian demonstration. Protesters are sporting signs and waving flags representing issues affecting Kashmiri, Ethiopian, Palestinian, and Ukrainian people, alongside groups supporting Canadian sovereignty and opposing various international policies. But here's what makes this situation particularly explosive. These diverse groups have converged into a unified force that's creating unprecedented pressure on Canadian authorities. What's particularly striking is the geographic reality of these protests. The G7 leaders themselves are meeting in the isolated mountain town of Kananaskis, roughly 80 kilometers west of Calgary, essentially hiding in the mountains while hundreds of Canadians are taking to the streets. The closest these protesters can get to actually confronting world leaders is through designated demonstration zones in Calgary, where officials have promised to live stream their messages to the secluded summit location. Think about the optics. Here, world leaders literally retreating to a mountain fortress while citizens flood the streets of Canada's energy capital. The police response has been significant and coordinated. The Calgary Police Service, working with the RCMP's Integrated Safety and Security Group, has established multiple designated demonstration zones across the city, including the Municipal Plaza on McLeod Trail, the Enoch East Victoria Park area, and additional zones near the airport. But here's where it gets really interesting. Police have deployed tactical units, protective gear, armored police and military vehicles, and officers on horseback. According to officials, these tools are reserved for worst-case scenarios and would only be deployed if necessary, but the fact that they're on standby shows just how seriously authorities are taking this situation. The security apparatus surrounding this G7 summit is absolutely massive. Police operations began weeks ago and involve a coordinated effort between multiple law enforcement agencies. The RCMP is leading what they call the Integrated Safety and Security Group, bringing together law enforcement, safety, and security partners in what appears to be one of the largest domestic security operations Canada has seen in recent years. This isn't just local Calgary police we're talking about. This is a federal security operation designed to handle exactly the kind of large-scale demonstrations we're seeing. What's particularly concerning authorities is that these protests aren't staying confined to designated zones. Reports indicate protesters have been marching through downtown Calgary's core, and there are indications that some groups have been blocking traffic and requiring police intervention. When you have protesters actively disrupting normal city operations while world leaders are meeting nearby, it creates exactly the kind of volatile situation that security officials have been preparing for. The diversity of causes being represented makes this situation particularly complex for law enforcement. We're seeing everything from international conflict awareness to domestic Canadian sovereignty concerns. Anti-Trump sentiment is particularly strong, which makes sense given the current U.S. administration's policies and the fact that President Trump is one of the G7 leaders attending this summit. When you have such a wide range of grievances being Expressed simultaneously, it becomes much harder for authorities to predict how events will unfold. The Calgary Raging Grannies, a group that's become somewhat legendary in Canadian protest circles, are among the demonstrators. But they're joined by much more militant organizations and international solidarity groups. When you have this kind of coalition forming, from grandmothers to hardcore activists, it signals that the concerns being raised have broad community support and staying power. The timing of these protests is strategically planned to maximize impact. They're happening as G7 leaders are conducting their most important meetings, which means maximum media attention and maximum pressure on the summit proceedings. International media outlets are picking up the story, which means the Calgary demonstrations are achieving one of their key goals, getting global attention for their causes while embarrassing the Canadian government on the world stage. But let's talk about what's really driving the intensity we're seeing. The 2025 G7 summit comes at a time of unprecedented global tension. We're dealing with ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, economic uncertainty, climate change concerns, and significant political polarization in many G7 countries. For many protesters, this summit represents their once-in-a-lifetime chance to directly confront the world leaders they see as responsible for these global crises. The international context makes these protests even more significant than typical domestic demonstrations. G7 summits have a history of attracting large-scale, sometimes violent demonstrations. We've seen clashes with police, property damage, mass arrests, and international incidents at previous summits in other countries. While Canadian officials expected the Alberta protests to be largely peaceful, the reality on the ground shows that peaceful doesn't necessarily mean small, easily managed, or confined to designated areas. The visual impact of what's happening in Calgary is undeniable and powerful. When hundreds of people flood the streets of a major Canadian city, requiring significant police deployment and creating scenes that look more like international crisis zones than typical Canadian protests, it creates imagery that travels around the world instantly. These aren't just local Canadian protests, these are international news events that will be seen by millions of people globally, potentially influencing how the G7 summit itself is perceived and remembered. What's particularly interesting is how the Canadian government has tried to balance constitutional protest rights with security concerns. The establishment of designated demonstration zones with live streaming capabilities shows an attempt to give protesters a voice while keeping them away from the actual summit location. Two G7 Calgary designated demonstration zones include infrastructure to broadcast live feeds of the protests to the leaders in Kananaskis, the Municipal Plaza and Enoch Shawk East Victoria Park locations. But as we're seeing, not all protesters are willing to be confined to these government-approved zones. The economic impact of these protests on Calgary shouldn't be underestimated. When major streets in downtown Calgary are affected by large-scale demonstrations, it impacts businesses, commuters, tourism, and the daily economic life of the city. This creates additional pressure on both protesters and police to manage the situation effectively while respecting everyone's rights and maintaining public safety. Looking at the broader picture, these Calgary protests represent something much larger than just opposition to specific G7 policies. They represent a growing frustration with international institutions and global governance structures that many people feel don't represent their interests or values. When you see Ukrainian flags alongside Palestinian flags alongside Canadian sovereignty banners, you're witnessing a coalition of people who feel completely left out of the global conversation about their own futures. The police response strategy has been carefully planned but is being tested in real time. Calgary police have stated they're confident about mitigating risks for both demonstrators and the public at the designated protest zones, and they've been working with organizers and community leaders to try to facilitate peaceful, lawful, and safe demonstrations. But the deployment of tactical units and specialized equipment suggests they're prepared for scenarios that go well beyond peaceful demonstration. The media coverage of these protests is achieving exactly what the organizers hoped for. When international outlets are reporting on Calgary protests, when social media is flooded with images of Canadian police in tactical gear facing off against diverse groups of protesters, when the story is trending globally, the protesters are winning the media battle even if they can't physically reach the G7 leaders. As this situation continues to develop over the remaining days of the G7 summit, several critical questions remain unanswered. Will the protests grow larger as more people see the media coverage and decide to join? Will police be forced to escalate their response if protesters continue to move beyond designated zones? Will the protesters' messages actually influence the G7 leaders' discussions and decisions? And perhaps most importantly, will these demonstrations have any lasting impact on Canadian protest culture and government responses to large-scale dissent? What we're witnessing in Calgary right now is democracy under pressure, the fundamental tension between the right to protest and the need for security, between grassroots expression and international diplomacy, between local grievances and global governance. The images coming out of Calgary are showing the world that Canadians are not as passive or compliant as international stereotypes might suggest. The next 24 to 48 hours will be absolutely crucial as the G7 summit reaches its most important sessions, and protesters potentially ramp up their activities. The world is watching Calgary, and what happens on these streets could set precedents for how Canada handles large-scale protests and international summit security for years to come. This is a developing story that perfectly captures the moment we're living in, where global governance meets grassroots resistance, where constitutional rights meet security concerns, where peaceful Canadian protest culture meets international crisis-level tensions. Calgary has become the unexpected epicenter of all these forces, and the outcome will reverberate far beyond Alberta's borders.